Beneath a modern shopping centre in Kilkenny city lays one of Ireland's darkest secrets. In the shadow of the Great Famine, the Kilkenny Union Workhouse became the final resting place for thousands, forgotten until a shocking discovery just 160 years later. But how did this dark chapter of Irish history become buried and forgotten under a modern city? And what can we learn from the dark discoveries made? This is The Resurrectionists. Hello everybody and welcome back to the Resurrectionist podcast. We are officially halfway through the season. Alarm bells, fun sounds, celebration noises. This week we will be talking about the Great Famine and more specifically the Kilkenny Union Workhouse during the worst years of the famine and the 1,000 skeletons that were discovered there. Before we get into the episode, I just want to remind everybody that I will be doing a Q&A at the end of the season coming out on Halloween. So if you have any questions about this episode, previous episodes, osteology, archaeology, morbid history in general, then you can leave a comment on Spotify if you're listening on Spotify, on YouTube if you're watching on YouTube, or you can DM me on Instagram at The Resurrection Woman. And if you leave a voice note, I will play the voice note for the episode. So yeah, let's get into this week's episode. So I thought I would start off with a brief history of the famine, and I laugh because what was supposed to be a brief history of the famine turned into me listening to podcast episodes on the famine all day, every day in work for a week, and then trying to narrow that down, and then failing miserably to narrow that down to like a short introduction, and still not fully understanding all the nuances to do with the famine and the politics of the famine, more specifically, like everything that went into it. It's a girthy topic. It be vast and girthy and under-researched, surprisingly. Actually, not surprisingly. It's still kind of a very dark mark on Irish history, I guess. It still leaves its scars, so I kind of understand why it's been under-researched until recently. But yeah, it was interesting to me because I learned about the famine in school. I am Irish. I learned about the famine in school. They took us to a famine ship when I was like 10, because that's a fun activity to take 10-year-olds to, a ship where thousands died while fleeing millions died. But yeah, so we learn about it in school, but there's just like so much that we don't learn in school that I was learning, and then stuff I obviously forgot from school, and just it's a very girthy topic. And if you're interested in learning more about the famine in general, then I would highly recommend the Irish History podcast. I think it's Finn Dwyer is the host, and he's got a series on the famine specifically, and it's like over 30 episodes long, and that's what I was listening to in work. I would highly recommend that podcast if you're interested in learning more about the famine in general. But here is my brief, possibly not so brief, introduction to Ireland and the famine before we get specifically into Kilkenny. So around the time the famine began, or slightly before the famine, the population of Ireland was thought to be around 8 million. Now, this is based off of census records, and the census at the time was not particularly accurate. A lot of people didn't get recorded for various reasons. So it's thought that this number is like a low estimation, and it could be that the population was closer to 9 million. We'll never really know, but just keep that in mind when I'm saying population numbers and stuff to you, that most of this stuff is based off of like census records, and records of the time are not always the most accurate. So at around this time in Ireland, the population was rapidly increasing, about 1 million every 10 years or so. There was about 200 people per square mile in Ireland, and then around did I say 2 million? I meant 200 people to a square mile in Ireland, but that increased to about 400 to a square mile in some of the cities like Dublin and Cork and Galway. Kilkenny is a city, but it's more a city by technicality. I think it's quite small when you're actually there. I lived there. I don't know if you call it lived there. I lived there during the week for about a month because I was working there, which is how I found out about the Kilkenny Union Workhouse and why I wanted to do this episode. It's a lovely city, but I feel like it is more of a city by technicality. So I don't know that they had the 400 to a square mile ratio that some of the other cities had. So of this 8 million population, about 2/3 of them were reliant on the land for survival, not for profit, purely for survival. Population of the poor or poorer in Ireland was higher than that of the middle class or upper class in Ireland. A lot of these farms were rented. I'd say all of them probably. Most of them were rented, not owned, and they were of less than 5 acres. The land was generally not considered to be good land. It was the worst kind of land. Not of huge great, I don't know, tillage, is that the right word? I don't know farming terms. But there weren't many crops and stuff that you could farm on this land. Many of the poor in Ireland lived in small one-room sort of mud huts that had these sort of sunken floors. There's a lot of descriptions given of what these huts look like from travelers who were visiting Ireland around this time. You have to keep in mind that these accounts are from non-natives to Ireland and from people who have a certain viewpoint in mind as to Ireland and the Irish poor. So some of these descriptions could be playing into these biases that these travelers have as to their understanding of the Irish poor as well. And there would have been about 5 to 7 people living per home, possibly more than one family as well. A lot of the Irish at the time are described, the poor Irish are described as wearing rags, just essentially like cloth held on by like string and ties and stuff like that. Not what they would have described as like proper clothing either. On the note of travelers to Ireland not really understanding the Irish poor, I do have like one sort of example of this which I found funny, which is the huts or like cottages that were on Achill have like rounded corners as opposed to squared off corners, and like some travelers described it as saying like the people of Ireland don't know how to make a right angled corner. The reality is the winds in Achill are really harsh, and a right angle corner makes it more likely that the wind's gonna like catch on the house and cause problems versus a rounded corner. So it was actually intentional. But it's just that idea of like people have a bias about the Irish and the Irish poor, so their descriptions might be playing into those biases. But that is to say that the Irish poor were still living in abysmal conditions and didn't have a lot going for them, essentially. So of the poor in Ireland, most of them, if not all of them, relied on a diet of potatoes and dairy. An average adult in Ireland ate approximately 12 to 13 pounds of potatoes with 3 pints of buttermilk a day, and this would equate to about 4,700 calories, which is more than the daily recommended these days. But you also have to keep in mind that these people would have been doing a lot of manual labor, so this caloric intake is probably actually correct for the amount of activity that they're doing in a day as well. So while they had a very sedentary diet of just potatoes and buttermilk, this diet was actually fairly nutritionally beneficial to them. I guess potatoes have a lot of different nutrients and vitamins in them, and then the buttermilk is giving them dairy intake as well. So while they were relying on one food source almost entirely, they were actually fairly healthy, and there are descriptions of the time saying that on average, the poor in Ireland were healthier than the poor of other European countries due to the fact that their diet was this potato, which was very nutritionally beneficial. Now, they had the kind of worst variety of potato. There were different varieties of potato in Ireland at the time. But the poorest usually had this, I think it's called like a lump potato or something, which apparently doesn't really have any flavour to it. It's mostly just kind of tastes like stodgy water, but was still nutritionally beneficial. So it may not have been a palatable diet, but it was getting them what they needed to survive day to day. However, this meant that the Irish poor were reliant on one crop. And if that crop failed, then it did lead to periods of famine. And there were short periods of famine between the 18th and 19th century in Ireland. And also, there were seasonal periods of famine when the previous year's like stock of potatoes had run out and the coming year's harvest hadn't been harvested yet, which also leads to the bias in some of the travellers' descriptions of the Irish poor, because even before the famine they were describing them as starving. But a lot of the people travelling to Ireland were coming in during the summer months when the previous year's potato harvest had sort of run out and the next year's harvest hadn't come in yet. So a lot of people who are travelling to Ireland are coming when there is this sort of seasonal famine going on. So they're seeing a period of famine and starvation going on in Ireland and presuming that that is Ireland in general, when in reality it is this sort of short seasonal gap. And if they came in the winter, they would have seen a much more abundance of potato. People would have been a lot better fed. So that's what I mean about these like biases of people coming into Ireland as well. So the period that we refer to as the Great Famine or the Great Hunger or An Gcirta Mór, which is the Irish for the Great Hunger, is the period from 1845 to 1852. Like I said, there were short famines before this, but this was the Great Famine of history. So the famine was caused by a blight on the potato crops, which was a kind of fungus that was attacking the potatoes, and it's called, please bear with me here, Phytophthora infestan. I think I got that right. I don't know. I'm dyslexic. Which was first seen on the potatoes in Ireland beginning August 1845. And this fungus caused these sort of brown, black spots on the leaves of the potatoes, and then it would turn the potato to this sort of brown, black, sort of squidgy nest that apparently produced this horrific odor and was completely inedible. They tried to find some way to eat the potatoes, to dry them out, or to extract like certain portions of them to eat, but they were just completely inedible, and the smell coming from them was horrific as well. So in 1845, the blight affected about 1/3 of the crop. And then in the years after that, in the next year, it affected 90% of the crop, and it just sort of got worse from there. And there were certain years of the famine, I believe, where the blight did not affect the crops at all. But by that point, people had been starving for years, and therefore didn't have the energy or the means, they didn't have the land anymore to be planting potatoes, or they probably didn't even have the hope anymore to waste their energy planting potatoes because there'd been blight in the previous years. So in the years that there weren't blight, there also weren't enough potatoes because people hadn't been planting them anymore, which again would lead to further famine the next year. So by mid-1846, the blight had started to affect 90% of the crops, and there was absolutely no food left in the country for anyone. But in the years after this, there was food available, not potatoes, but maize and oats and bread. There was other kinds of foods available in Ireland, but the prices began to soar and people couldn't afford them, which is what led the famine to continue on as it did for as many years as it did. There were many famine relief schemes put in place by the British government. Keep in mind that Ireland was a part of the UK at this point in history. So there were famine relief schemes put into place, but they were never enough, or they never went on long enough, or they just weren't. It's kind of hard to explain because there was a lot of different relief schemes and they all had their own sort of unique issues, or the ones that did work weren't kept in place for long enough to do any major impact on the numbers to help enough people. So there is some attempt being made across the years of the famine to sort of help subsidize food for people, but it's never enough help, or it's never the right kind of help. And some argue that the British should have stopped exporting, because they were exporting food out of Ireland into the UK, and some argue that the UK government should have put a stop to the exporting. But again, this would have caused financial issues for Ireland as well. A temporary export in 1946 may have helped the issue, but it's arguable as to how well this would have helped. Like I said, there's a lot of debate and politics that goes into the famine, and a lot of people who know much more about the famine than I do and are well more versed in all of this still argue back and forth as to who's to blame for the famine, and was it man-made, was it natural, was it a genocide, like all of this. I'm not going to get involved in that because much more learned people than I still cannot come to a conclusion, so why am I going to get involved? But yeah, there's a lot of this going on. I do think it is important to note that while the UK didn't stop exporting food, it was also the Irish upper class who were exporting the food, and they didn't want to have a ban on exportation because that's how they made their money. So this wasn't a UK versus Ireland thing. This was a upper class versus lower class thing, regardless of nationality. And I think some people kind of forget that in this. There's a lot of lost empathy when it comes to the famine. When you look into it, you can see that it's just people did not have a lot of empathy for what was going on at the time. So obviously this famine led to mass amounts of starvation across Ireland. Like I said before, 2/3 of people were reliant on the land and on potatoes to survive in Ireland, and without the potatoes, those people began to starve. A lot of accounts of the time refer to the people of Ireland as looking like walking skeletons, the poor of Ireland as looking like walking skeletons. Migration also became huge at the time, and it is thought that about 1 million people emigrated on these so-called famine ships or coffin ships. Like I said, we went to visit one of these when I was a child in school, and I was probably around 10. And they pretty much just take you onto this really big old wooden ship. They're pretty cool, they're impressive, and they tell you about the horrific conditions that Ireland had at the time and why all these people were emigrating, and then the horrific conditions that they had to endure on the ships, and then how so many of them died, and there was rats and disease, and it's all the British's fault. That's essentially what we learn at 10 years old in Ireland. It was a fun old time. If you ever get the chance to see a famine ship, I'd maybe go look at them. They're kind of interesting. But yeah, so a lot of people emigrated, mostly to the UK, the US, and Canada. If you could afford it, I believe you would attempt to go to the US and Canada because they were seen as these lands of opportunity and abundant. And then if you had slightly less money, but still enough money to leave Ireland, you would go to the UK instead. Interesting to note that the UK did export or deport people back to Ireland who became paupers while living in the UK. So in 1847, which is often referred to as Black 47, one of the worst years of the famine, 15,000 people were deported back to Ireland after becoming paupers in the UK. So just because you managed to scrounge up enough money to get a ticket to the UK did not mean that you were safe now from the famine or from having to return to Ireland. If you became a pauper while you were in the UK, you could get deported back to Ireland. So during the years of the famine, the crime rates rapidly grew, and this is after a steady decline in the crime rates before the famine started. There was a lot of violence, a lot of murder going on as well. People were getting desperate, and when they get desperate, they turn to violence in order to survive, essentially. The birth rates greatly diminished during this time as well. There was almost no children being born. Those that were being born very frail and very sickly as well. And because of the starvation and the deaths, this also led to disease as well. So typhus, typhoid, smallpox, and tuberculosis became big during the famine. And then also there was a huge cholera outbreak during the famine as well. So in Ireland, we sort of have this tradition of the Irish wake and the Irish burial. We give a lot of credence to ensuring that people have a good burial and a good death. Essentially, we celebrate life. People back then would have saved up for years for their own funerals to ensure that they got a good send-off. And that's sort of ingrained in the Irish mentality that you wanted your loved ones to have a good send-off, and that it would be shameful and disrespectful to give them anything less than this big Irish wake. But in the years of the famine, this just wasn't possible. And sometimes people didn't even get coffins. They have these sort of sliding coffin that I've seen described in a few things, where the body would be placed in a coffin sort of for all the pre-burial stuff, and then when it got to the graveside, they'd sort of like slide all the panels away, drop the body down into the grave without a coffin, so that that sliding coffin could be reused, because people just couldn't afford coffins anymore. In many cases, people were burying relatives and family members, friends on their own land, because they couldn't afford to pay for them to be buried in cemeteries. They couldn't afford to pay for somebody else to even dig the grave for them. And there's a lot of folklore stories that surround the sort of abysmal conditions that were going on when it comes to death and burial in Ireland around the famine. And it's just sort of in stark contrast to the Irish way of doing death and burial before the famine. And it kind of shows how desperate people were getting, that they went from the funeral process being like this huge importance to them, to just burying people in really shallow graves in their back gardens because they couldn't afford anything else, or they didn't even have the energy for anything else. There are folklore tales of dogs digging up graves and like bringing body parts home to their masters because the graves were so shallow, or of children pushing wheelbarrows with their dead parents in them, or people just dying on the streets and their bodies being left there. That was how bad things got during the worst years of the famine. And so overall, it is thought that about 1 million people died during the famine. And again, this is based off of census records, off of church records, workhouse records, to sort of gather this number. And it might be an underestimation of how many people died as well. Of these 1 million people, it's thought that about 472,000 of them were children under the age of 10. And many of these children are thought to have come from union workhouses as well. So whether through death or to emigration, around 2 million people vanished from Ireland in the years during the famine. And this led to disastrous consequences for generations to come in the country. Entire villages just vanished, communities completely disappeared, families were eradicated. The country was changed forever by what happened during the famine. There was almost an entire generation that was never born because of the abysmal birth rates during the famine. And then those children who grew up during the famine, many of them died. And those that didn't were probably left with physical and emotional scarring from what they saw during the famine that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. The famine itself left physical scars all over the country. These famine huts, many of them still remain completely abandoned across the country. A lot of them are just four walls, no roof, complete ruins at this point, but there's markers of the famine all over the country. Not only were there national consequences for the famine, but there were also international consequences as well. There's sort of this common statistic given, I don't know how accurate it is, but it is stated commonly when referring to the international consequences of the famine, and that's 1 in 4 people in New York after the famine were of Irish birth. Again, I don't know how accurate it is, but even if it's not accurate, it is giving you an idea of how impactful the emigration from the famine has been on other countries as well. So not only was the famine impactful on Ireland in the years and decades that followed, but even now, over 170 years later, we're seeing the implications of the famine on the Irish population. Like I said, at the time of the famine, the population in Ireland was around 8 million people. Today, as of April 2024, the current population of the Republic of Ireland is 5.38 million. And there's approximately 2 million more in Northern Ireland. Like I said, at the time, Ireland was a part of the UK, so therefore Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland were one country. So that 8 million population is the entire island of Ireland. But even now, the population of Ireland combined with the population of Northern Ireland does not equal the population at the time of the famine. And the highest recorded population of Ireland was in the 1841 census, and it was recorded at 8.1 million. And we have never gotten back to this number. So the population in Ireland never recovered from the famine. So before I go further into the very morbid famine and get into the union workhouses that existed during the famine, I thought I'd take a little light-hearted break for some positive news from the famine. So in 1847, a Native American nation known as I'm going to butcher this and I apologize in advance, Choctaw Nation? Choctaw. I apologize profusely if I have butchered that. But they donated $170, which is approximately equivalent to $500 in today's currency, to the town of Middleton in County Cork when they heard about the tragedy of the famine and what was happening in Ireland. 16 years before this, the nation had endured the Trial of Tears, and thousands of their own had died of starvation and disease. So when they heard what was happening in Ireland, they wanted to help because they remembered what they had endured, and they just wanted to give something to the Irish people to try and help them through their hour of need. And this sort of relationship that was built between Ireland, not just the Choctaw Nation, but Native Americans in general, sort of still endures to this day. So in 2017, a statue of 9 eagle feathers called Kindred Spirits was erected in Middleton, County Cork, to commemorate this donation that was made by the Choctaw Nation. And then in 2018, the Taoiseach, which is like our Prime Minister, I guess, announced that there will be a scholarship for Choctaw students to study in Ireland. In 2012, during COVID, there was a GoFundMe account set up for the Navajo people to help with COVID-19, what was going on with them during the pandemic. On the GoFundMe, about $500,000 was donated by Irish individuals, many of whom wrote that this was their way of paying back the kindness that the Choctaw had shown us during the famine as well. And then in September 2024, so this month, the Choctaw erected their own statue to sort of commemorate the unity now that sort of existed between our two people, I guess. And it's a Celtic trinity shape intertwined with a heart. and it is placed facing in the direction of Ireland, and it's called the Eternal Heart. So I just thought that would be a little light-hearted moment in the midst of all the doom and gloom. But now back to the doom and gloom. So union workhouses were created in response to the Poor Law Act of 1838, and there was 163 constructed in Ireland and open in Ireland between 1841 and 1853. Now, I say 163, I've also seen it written as 130. More inclined to believe the 163 number just because that seems more exact, whereas 160 or 130 is like more rounded, but it could be either one of these. I'm not sure why there's two different numbers going around. These were built in the opposition of people's wishes. People didn't want these workhouses to be built. They were built anyways. It was part of this Poor Law Act. So the intention of the workhouse was to provide a more effectual relief of the destitute poor in Ireland. So they were supposed to provide food and accommodation for the pauper population of Ireland, and this food and accommodation was provided in exchange for unpaid work in the workhouses. Hence why they are called workhouses. So it was the belief at the time that the poor were lazy and that poverty was self-inflicted, and as such these workhouses were intentionally made to be as harsh and as unattractive as possible to try and encourage what they would call economic self-improvement. So essentially they made these workhouses inhospitable as possible to prove that you were truly desperate if you wanted to be in one of these workhouses. Applicants were asked to weigh the pleasures of staying outdoor versus the pain of entering it. And only the deserving poor were permitted entrance into the workhouses. So only those who could prove that they really had nowhere else to go and that this was their last port of call. The workhouses were designed to only be wanted and needed by the most desperate in society. They often took the elderly, the infirm, or the disabled, so those who truly had nowhere else to turn but these workhouses. They were convinced that the poor were trying to cheat the system and that they would try and get anything for free that they could. And so they made it increasingly difficult for people to get aid because they were convinced people were trying to cheat aid out of them. Despite the fact that they've made these workhouses literally like the worst option available to people, they were still convinced people were trying to cheat them into getting places in the workhouses as well. I feel like every time I read into workhouses and just people's thoughts of the poor in general, I can see such a disconnect between people in power and the poor when they talk about like them cheating supplies and cheating food and like trying to con the system essentially. I'm like, you truly do not understand the desperation of people and how much they did not want to be in these workhouses. There was so much shame and stigma attached to being in these workhouses. Even after the famine, people who had survived because of the workhouses didn't speak about them because there was so much shame attached to having been in one. So these workhouses were supposed to have been paid for with a poor rate tax, which was a tax that was given to people in the areas of the workhouses to pay for the workhouses. However, in the beginning, this may have worked to some extent. Of course, people didn't really want to pay to take care of the poor. Like I said, they saw poverty as a self-inflicted act, and therefore they didn't really want to help these people, but it was a legal tax, so they paid it. But as the famine went on and started to affect more and more people, not just the poorest of societies, but it started to creep up the social chain as well. Those who were supposed to be paying the taxes for the workhouses couldn't afford them. And in some cases, those who were supposed to be paying for the tax for the workhouse ended up in the workhouses themselves. And so the workhouses were running out of money. They were buying things on credit, and eventually places stopped giving them credit as well. There's cases of them running out of food at times to be able to feed people. And at some point, the government had to step in, but this still didn't really help matters much either. As the famine went on, these workhouses began to become overcrowded as well. So one of the government schemes that had been put in place in 1847 to help with the famine relief were soup kitchens. However, they closed these soup kitchens in August 1847. This is one of the measures I mentioned that worked but wasn't kept in place long enough. This caused even more overcrowding in the workhouses because the people who had been previously surviving off of the soup kitchens now weren't getting any food and were turning towards the workhouses instead. The workhouses at the time were only permitted to provide indoor relief, meaning they were only supposed to give food to those who were in the workhouse and who were working these unpaid jobs in exchange for the food and the accommodation. However, when they closed the soup kitchens and the number of people entering the workhouses skyrocketed, the government permitted the workhouses to start providing outdoor relief. There's also cases of abuses of power going on in the workhouses. It's said that people who worked in the workhouses were often stealing food from people there, that nurses would be stealing alcohol from the medical supplies. They'd be taking food not only for themselves, but also to sell on the outside. You have to keep in mind that the people who are working at the workhouses were obviously of a better social standing, socioeconomic standing than the people who are in the workhouses, but they weren't getting paid a lot. These workhouses didn't have any money. They were hemorrhaging money. They were in the red, and their staff members were not getting paid well enough, and it's a famine. So this is what I mean as well when I say that the empathy sort of, as the famine went on, the empathy drained out of people, and it was every man for themselves, and they all just sort of stopped caring about what was happening to other people. As long as they and theirs could survive, they didn't really care what was happening to anyone else. Across Ireland, the workhouses went from 40,000 to 100,000 inmates between 1846 and 1847. So in just a year, there is 60,000 people entering the workhouse. And eventually they had to close the applicants because they just couldn't take the numbers anymore. And then in 1848 to 1849, we have a cholera epidemic breaking out, and this affected the workhouses as well. So there was a lot of people dying of cholera in these workhouses. And across the length of the famine, it's thought that 250,000 people died in workhouses, and that approximately 200,000 of these were from famine-induced conditions. So conditions that were exaggerated by the starvation caused by the famine. So like I said, there was also children that were in these workhouses as well. Children were generally accepted more easily than adults because obviously they could easily prove that they were in more desperate need of help than adults could, especially orphaned or abandoned children. There were many children at this time who sadly were abandoned by their parents who emigrated abroad. Now, I'm sure the idea was that the parents would send money back in some cases, but there were a lot of children who got abandoned during the famine, and then these orphaned and abandoned children would have turned to the workhouses to survive. There was also children being born in the workhouses as well. Now we move on to Kilkenny. So Kilkenny is a county in Ireland, but there is also the city of Kilkenny in the county of Kilkenny in Ireland. And the city is one of the best preserved medieval cities in Ireland. It's actually a really beautiful city. It's got this nice castle in the middle of it and all these sort of narrow, winding medieval streets. If you ever have the opportunity, I would highly recommend going to visit Kilkenny. It is known as a retail destination. Even back then, it was considered to be one of the most fashionable cities for shopping in the country. Like I said, the streets are these sort of narrow and winding medieval streets, but this sort of led to poor sanitation as the years went on. There wasn't a lot of drainage in the area, and then poor sanitation, of course, would lead to disease going on in the area as well. Around the time of the famine, or slightly before the famine, the unemployment in Kilkenny was really high. It was at about 8%, and it was considered one of the poorest counties in Leinster. The famine hit Kilkenny particularly hard. Now, the west of Ireland was hit the worst by the famine. Kilkenny's not in the west, but it was thought to have been hit pretty hard by the famine, despite not being in the west. So the Kilkenny Union Workhouse was opened in 1842, so 3 years before the famine, and it was the fifth largest workhouse in the country. It was built to house 1,300 inmates, and yes, the people in the workhouse were referred to as inmates, and I feel like that says a lot. So workhouse buildings were designed in this sort of H shape. They had accommodation and an infirmary, and then there would be a separate administrative building in the front of the complex as well. The building was segregated into men, women, girls, and boys, and then girls and boys would have been under 15 years of age. So before the famine, or in the early years of the famine, the workhouses managed to function fairly well. There was some overcrowding, but they managed to control it fairly well, and for the purposes it was built for, worked okay. And then when the famine hit, that's not what they were built for, and so they quickly became severely overcrowded. And in the case of Kilkenny, auxiliary buildings had to be rented around the city to accommodate the increasing number of people that were being accepted into the workhouses as well. Even before it was legal for the workhouses to provide outdoor relief, it said that the Kilkenny workhouse was illegally providing outdoor relief to people. Presumably this is when they had the resources to do that before they started severely hemorrhaging money. So just to give you kind of idea of what was going on during one of the worst years of the famine in the Kilkenny Union Workhouse. So in the minutes from notes from the 24th of July, 1847, there were 2,124 inmates in the prison. Keep in mind, it's only supposed to house 1,300 inmates. Of this 2,124, there were hundreds in the fever hospital, and in the week of the 24th of July, 38 people had died. And by 1851, near the end of the famine, there were 4,357 people in the workhouse. So between 1845 and 1852, an estimated 4,111 people died in the Kilkenny Union Workhouse. People who died in the workhouse were buried with coffins and shrouds in the city's cemeteries when they could afford them. It seems that in Kilkenny they continued to be able to afford coffins throughout the famine. In many workhouses they couldn't, and they ended up just having to use shrouds to cover people. And possibly they were using the sliding coffin system as well. However, in Kilkenny, it seems they were continuously able to afford coffins. So there was no one plot that was dedicated to the Kilkenny Union Workhouse. They used cemeteries all over the city to bury the dead. However, in August 1847, they ran out of room in the city cemeteries and ended up having to use the workhouse land to bury the dead. And this possibly coincides with an outbreak of typhus that was going on in the workhouse as well, and may explain why they ran out of room in the city cemeteries as well. This plot that they used on the workhouse land was placed in the north of the compound, which is as far away as possible from the premises and the accommodations. So they were trying to keep it as far away from people as possible, possibly to sort of keep it more sanitary, yes, as well. This was completely frowned upon by people. It was known by the local community that this is what was going on, and it was frowned upon. They really weren't supposed to be doing this, but there was nowhere else for them to bury the dead, especially when they began running out of money as well. They couldn't afford plots anywhere else, and there wasn't room anywhere else. Eventually, by March 1851, they did manage to secure space elsewhere, and they started burying the dead back in this cemetery that they managed to procure. However, for a number of years, they were burying individuals on the land of the workhouse. And despite the fact that this was known by the people who lived in Kilkenny, the cemetery was completely forgotten by 160 years later. So if the mass burial at the Kilkenny Union Workhouse was completely forgotten, how did we manage to find and excavate it? Well, in 2005, construction was going on the formerly abandoned workhouse to convert it into a modern shopping centre, the McDonough Junction Shopping Centre. And it was during this construction work that they came across the mass burial. Between January and June 2006, excavations took place to expose and remove all of the individuals that had been buried there. Now, like I said, this mass burial had been completely forgotten and was unexpected when they came across it at the time, which is really interesting when you think about it, because they are working on the land of a workhouse. So they obviously did a lot of archaeological and historical research before they started construction, as is legally mandated in Ireland. And the area was probably marked as an area of potential archaeological significance because the workhouse would have been considered archaeological, and anything found there would have been considered archaeological. They had archaeologists on site to keep an eye out for if they did find anything, but nobody was expecting to find a mass burial because there was not supposed to be one there. The ground was unconsecrated and unmarked. It wasn't on any maps. It wasn't in local knowledge or folklore. There wasn't anything to suggest that there should be bodies there, which, when you consider that these people were only buried there 160 years beforehand, just sort of shows you how completely people wanted to wipe everything to do with the famine and the workhouses from local knowledge and from history. So during the excavation, approximately 1,000 bodies were excavated, and over half of these were those of children. Now, this 1,000 bodies does not account for every individual that would have died in the workhouse between the period that they were using the workhouse land for burials. Individuals may have been reclaimed by friends and family and buried elsewhere. This isn't everyone who died, but it is giving us a snapshot of the individuals who were living and dying in the workhouse during some of the worst years of the famine. So when they excavated it, they found that the individuals had been buried in coffins, and that there was a minimum of 63 sub-rectangular pits that had been dug, and then the coffins were placed stacked on top of each other in these pits. The pits were approximately 1.5 to 2 meters long by 1.5 meters wide, and at most were 1.5 meters deep. They all faced southwest, northwest, or northeast along the northern boundary wall of the complex as well. And then there was a further 8 or 11 pits that were left unexcavated because they were outside the area of construction, and therefore they wouldn't have been disturbed by the construction, so there was no need to excavate them. All but one of these 63 pits contained coffins and human remains. It's thought that the one pit that didn't possibly had been dug to put coffins in, or individuals in, and then they managed to procure space elsewhere, and then they just backfilled that pit because they didn't need it anymore. There is an average of 16 coffins per pit. This ranges from 14 at the least and 22 at the most, and it's thought that there was about one pit dug per week. So each of these pits represents a week in the life of the workhouse. There were 9 cases where children had been buried in the same coffin as adults. This is thought to have been done to save space, and it's probably not likely that these children were related to the adults. There is one case where there was a infant placed up in the arm of a woman, like sort of curled up into her arm. So this case, maybe it was a mother and her child, but we don't know. And then there's one case where there were two children buried together in a coffin. There were some objects found with individuals, such as rosary beads, rings, religious medals. It's also possible that there were organic materials that were buried with people, but these wouldn't have survived archaeologically. It's thought that though there wasn't a lot of artifacts found buried with people, it's possible that individuals sold most of their artifacts or items before they entered the workhouse. Like I said, you wanted to be in a truly desperate state to enter the workhouse. You probably would have sold everything you had long before you turned to the workhouse for help. And so these items may reflect some of the only things that these individuals owned when they entered the workhouses. And they are also probably couldn't have been returned to their friends and family. I believe there's cases of friends and family trying to reclaim items from individuals who died in the workhouses and they weren't permitted to, so they would have been buried with them. So like I said, this mass burial on the land began in August 1847 and ended in March 1851, and this reflects some of the worst years in the famine. So this gives us a really unique insight into individuals who were living in these workhouses at the time of the famine. This is the largest excavated mass burial in Ireland and is the largest famine burial ever excavated and studied. So giving us a really unique insight into what's going on in the famine at a human level. A lot of what we know about the famine are written records, and like I said before, a lot of these can be biased, especially the individual accounts of people's everyday lives. So this sort of gives us a really human look, I guess, at what's going on for the worst off in society during the famine. So the individuals excavated from the Kilkenny Union Workhouse were studied by Johnny Geber. Geber. I'm dyslexic. Sorry, Johnny. Between 2008 and 2012, I found it really difficult to find just basic information on the number of adults, even really, because I couldn't find papers. And it turns out Google Scholar does not look at ResearchGate when it's telling you where to find articles. So look on ResearchGate under Johnny Geber if you want to read more on this. Also, he has a book called Victims of Ireland's Great Famine, the Bioarchaeology of Mass Burials at Kilkenny Union Workhouse. I did manage to read for free on Google Books, like 2.5 chapters of this book, and it's very informative from what I did read, so I would highly recommend reading that if you want to know more as well. But also I am saying that to highlight that I did not get the opportunity to read the whole book, so I'm basing most of what I say off of the small bit of the book I did read and the papers I managed to get a hold of. So there is thought to be a minimum number of 970 individuals buried at the site from the number that was excavated. Keep in mind, 8 to 11 pits that have not been excavated. So 970 is the minimum number of individuals, and this is determined by 846 articulated individuals. So they are individuals who are fully or mostly articulated, and therefore they are certain that there's 846 of them. But then there was a number of disarticulated remains, and this was calculated to be about 130 for the minimum number. So in this case, they've determined that the minimum possible number of individuals that could be at the site altogether is 970. And the disarticulation that happened was due to coffin collapse. So I'm understanding that to mean that there were like pockets where the soil was not compacted completely when they placed the coffins in, and then as the coffins started to deteriorate, there was sort of sliding and collapsing happening, so some of the remains ended up getting commingled and disarticulated. So there was remarkably good preservation for the site, and in some cases there was even still soft tissue attached to the skeletons, which is creepy. So this breaks down to 216 males, adult males, and 200 adult females. So there were more females aged 26 to 35 than there were males, but there were more males on the site aged 36 plus. And then below the age of 26, it's more of an even divide between males and females. So we can see from what's going on with the remains as well that the non-adult mortality rate was exceptionally high when compared to other 19th century cemeteries. We have to keep in mind that the other 19th century cemeteries that they're comparing to are not famine cemeteries, so obviously the mortality rates are going to be vastly different in a famine cemetery population, especially one from a workhouse. And we also need to keep in mind, like I said, some people were probably being reclaimed by family and friends, whereas many of the children in workhouses would have been orphans or abandoned, or their parents were in the workhouses as well, and therefore their remains may not have been reclaimed. So it is possible that we're seeing more children because their bodies were being reclaimed, the same as adults were. It is also reflective of what we do know about child mortality during the famine as well. So I don't think that that is skewing the numbers in any kind of dramatic sense, but it is important to note as well. So over half of the individuals excavated from the workhouse were children, and most of these were aged between 1 and 5 years. I believe the youngest age group of individuals that they have noted for the workhouse is younger than 1 month old as well. So you're really seeing like every age group of child here. So we know from historical records that the famine was disastrous for children and for child mortality. However, there's been relatively little to no research done on this until the Kilkenny Union Workhouse and until the work that Johnny's done looking at the children and the child mortality within the workhouse. So I think one of the sadder things that I learned about what was going on at the workhouse as well has to do with this spike in child mortality we're seeing around the age of 2 to 3 as well. So in the workhouse, children were permitted to stay with their parents until the age of 2, and then they were sent out to the respective boys and girls children's areas of the workhouse. And so we're seeing a child mortality rate spike between the ages of 2 and 3, which could be suggesting that being taken away from their parents and put in with the other children was disastrous for children's health within the workhouse as well, may possibly have been leading to a spike in deaths. So amongst the children, there were 8 that showed sign of trauma. However, these cases of trauma were likely related to malnutrition and poor health, conditions such as rickets, which caused the bone to be more susceptible to trauma and more easily breaking. So it's thought that these cases of trauma were related to that. There was one case of a 3 to 4 year old child who had a broken forearm, so their radius and ulna was broken. But the type of break is more commonly associated with falling onto an outstretched hand and is actually quite a common childhood injury. So again, this is not thought to be related to any violence against the children. There is no evidence in the osteological assemblage to suggest that there was violence being inflicted upon these children. However, we do have historical records of violence against the children. There is one case of a 10-year-old boy named Edmund Bremen, who was severely beaten and whipped with a belt by another inmate in the workhouse. And then there's also a case of a 2-month-old named Mary Maguire Mahone. She was 2 months old and she died of starvation, not because the workhouse wasn't feeding her, but because her mother wasn't feeding her. So there was child abuse going on at the workhouse. There's also a case of a schoolmaster who was dismissed for severely beating a number of boys in the workhouse as well. So there was violence being inflicted from the staff, from other inmates, from parents against the children at the workhouse. is in the case of the schoolmaster, the workhouse did have, I guess, a certain degree at which they said that's too much violence and we're dismissing people or were pulling people up on charges for harming the children. So historically we do have records of abuse, but osteologically we're not seeing it or not seeing any convincing evidence for it. So one of the other really interesting things we're seeing going on at the site is the rate of scurvy. So 499 individuals in total were thought to have had scurvy, and this accounts for 2/3 of the children and half of the adults. The highest rate of scurvy was between 1 and 17-year-olds. There is cases of scurvy in infants less than 1 month old as well. So scurvy is caused by a vitamin C deficiency. And so this is showing us this lack of the potato in the diet as well. So individuals would have been receiving vitamin C from the potatoes before the famine. So these extremely high rates of scurvy that are going on the site are a direct reflection of the lack of potatoes in individuals' diets at this time. So some of the diagnostic criteria for scurvy osteologically is porosity, so small little holes. I saw it described in one thing as kind of like woodworm holes. I saw it described somewhere on the bone, particularly in the teeth sockets, around the palate at the top of the mouth, and the sphenoid, which is a bone inside your skull, and along the mandible as well. So scurvy can cause severe pain and can sometimes lead to pseudo-paralysis as well. It can also lead to depression and apathy. It can cause bruising, paling of the skin, sunken eyes. Interestingly, I find this very interesting, there is no mention in the records from the Union Workhouse from the doctors of scurvy being in the Union Workhouse. And there is, however, mention of this gastric fever, an outbreak of gastric fever going on in the workhouse. And so it is thought that this was a misdiagnosis of scurvy. So I find this to be a really interesting case of doctors at the time weren't 100% sure as to what was going on, but osteologists looking at the remains can be like, oh, it was scurvy. I just think that's really interesting that we're diagnosing things 160, 170 years later. It's possible that one of the reasons why the doctors were misdiagnosing this is that previous to this, scurvy would have been more commonly seen in sailors who weren't receiving proper nutrition while out at sea, and that inland doctors weren't familiar with the condition to the same extent that doctors seeing to sailors or on ships would be, and therefore they were misdiagnosing it as some sort of gastric condition instead. I saw it written somewhere that the rates of scurvy seen at the Union Workhouse are one of the highest rates ever recorded archaeologically, which is showing how deficient the population was in basic nutrients that they needed for survival. And it is the first opportunity to study scurvy in a known archaeological famine population as well. There's a lot of information that they're getting out of the Union Workhouse individuals that reflect things that we previously were not able to research, or that there wasn't a lot of research done into, such as child mortality during the famine and scurvy, certain deficiencies, nutritional deficiencies during the famine as well. So the Union Workhouse has given us this really unique glimpse into what was going on at an individual health level and a population health level during some of the worst years of the famine. So just to go over some of the other paleopathological, the diseases that we're seeing in the assemblages, we're seeing dental diseases such as dental caries, we're seeing osteomyelitis, which is bone infections, we're seeing in the children stunted growth and rickets. All of this is associated with poor nutrition, poor diet. The osteomyelitis infections will likely have been from before individuals entered the workhouse, but it is reflecting upon a hard-lived, poor existence before life in the workhouse as well. We are also seeing some cases of syphilis in these individuals as well. If you watched my Crossbones episode or listened to the Crossbones episode, we go a lot more into syphilis there. There was an army barracks nearby to the workhouse, so it's thought that possibly some of the individuals who had syphilis were, previous to entering the workhouse, working in prostitution at the army barracks, and that's how they contracted the syphilis. There is also 3 children found at the site, aged 6, 7, and 13, which show signs of switching from a potato diet to a maize diet. So again, this is showing us the switch from the pre-famine diet to a famine relief diet. It is evidence of the potato being completely cut out of their diet, and then the introduction of maize, which was one of the famine relief measures that was going on. So all in all, this is giving us a really interesting and unique, first of its kind glimpse into what was going on for individuals during the famine, what kind of diseases they had, and what kind of health implications the famine was having on individuals as well. It's giving us a look at what life in the workhouse was like for individuals and what they were contending with before they entered the workhouse, during their time at the workhouse, and what their deaths and burials were like afterwards. So all in all, I think it's really interesting study into the famine and into workhouse existence during the worst years of the famine as well. So where are these individuals now? Well, in 2010, in a multi-denominational ceremony, the individuals were reburied on the site of the now McDonough Junction shopping centre, formerly the Workhouse. And a few years later, there was a memorial statue placed on the spot as well. So there's this like big statue there now, and then this like little plaque that mentions the history of what was going on there and the individuals that are buried there as well. So it's a nice little spot that they've got there. And they had this whole ceremony. There was people from the local community. There was government officials from the community there. There was soldiers there. There was individuals invited from the different churches in the area, the different religious groups in the area as well, in this sort of commemorative ceremony for these individuals, and they were reburied on the site. And then a couple of years later, they introduced the Kilkenny Famine experience, I believe it's called. Basically what it is, I've actually done it while I was in Kilkenny, and it's what inspired this whole episode. Clearly it's working to promote the heritage of the famine and the workhouse. But basically what it is if you go up to the help desk in the shopping centre and ask them, can you do the tour, they just give you like a little headset and this little, like, it's about the size of a phone, but it's just this like little touch screen thing. It's all for free, and you just walk around the shopping centre, and there's different areas of the shopping centre that are numbered, and you click on the number on the little screen, and then it tells you about what that area used to be. It shows you photos and just basically gives you the history of the workhouse. And if you go out to the memorial, which is the last spot, I believe, on the tour, then it tells you about the individuals and the excavations that went on there as well. So it is a really interesting little tour. It's free, so if you have time when you're in Kilkenny, I would recommend doing it. On a more, I don't know, funny, ironic, not really very funny, kind of in bad taste note, there is a food court in the middle of the shopping centre in what once used to be one of the open air areas of the workhouse, but now has a glass ceiling on it. It's actually a really nice food court, except for the fact that it's called the Workhouse Food Court. And I just want to know who did that, because that's in bad taste, sir. I'm presuming it was a sir. If you're not, if you're a madam, I apologize, but that is in bad taste. Who thought it was a good idea to name the food court the Workhouse Food Court? Seriously? Anyway, on that note, thank you for listening for this week's episode. If you want to learn more about the famine in general, then I highly recommend checking out the Irish History podcast, which will be in the reference list below. I'll also be linking references to all of Johnny Geber's papers that I read and to his book down below. So if you're interested in learning more specifically about the Kilkenny Union Workhouse, then you can check those out. Like I said, there's also a YouTube video of a lecture talking about it, so I will link that below as well. Thank you everybody for listening or watching, and I will see you all next Morbid Monday. Bye!